Welcome back. This is week 15, lecture 1, Confessionalization and the End of Toleration. Now, you may notice straight away that there's a different background here. That's not because I have some screen thing that I put up behind me. It's because up until this point, I've been recording my lectures at home, in my room at home. Whereas now I'm in my office at the university. So that accounts for that. I hope it won't be a distraction. This lecture continues from where we left off with the previous lecture, which is dealing with patterns of Reformation and, in some ways, the outcomes. And in the previous lecture, I talked about the Schmalkaldic Wars, the Peace of Augsburg, which sort of settled the religio-political question within the empire, at least for the next some 60 years, until the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, which is beyond the confines of this course. But at least it came to a solution in 1555. I also briefly went over the Radical Reformation and then the English Reformation in terms of different patterns of Reformation. And I'll be coming back to those, at least the English Reformation, later today in this lecture, as well as looking at the situation in France. I've mentioned the issue of confessionalization before, in terms of it really beginning with the Confession of Augsburg at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. That's something you have to keep in mind, the distinction between the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, the presentation of the Confession of Augsburg, which then became the basis for the Reformation and the introduction of the Reformation within the empire, and then the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which kind of settled the matter for the time being, in any case. It put an end to the military conflict, even though there's still tensions, and led to the solution of the religion of the prince being the religion of the territory of the prince, whose reign is the rule, or there should only be one religion in any one reign or territory. And I argued that this was not a toleration. It was diversity because now there were two religious confessions, but it was not an issue of opening up and toleration. The point with confessionalization, as we go through, let's say from 1530 on to the end of the 16th century and then beyond, so often the Reformation has been portrayed as this time of toleration and openness, and it was absolutely not that. It's almost the opposite of that. It's really the beginning of the lack of toleration. Why? Because doctrine is increasingly being defined, and not only being defined, imposed politically, religiously, territorially. Now, the theory of confessionalization is not mine. It was developed in the later 1970s and early 80s by two German scholars. But it's a way to understand what was going on in the 16th century. And we're going to be looking more at that in this lecture. But in some ways, both last lecture and this lecture form a whole. It could all be subsumed under the title Confessionalization and the End of Toleration, because that's what we were seeing last lecture in terms of the empire, and a little bit with England. I'll be coming back to England in this lecture. And we sets the stage for what was early modernity. And if we want to look at this transformation from medieval forms of culture and politics and understandings to early modern, what makes for that transformation? And the attempt to enforce religious conformity is central. And that really comes about as a result of the upheavals of the Reformation, the 16th century, beginning with Luther, and then we get to the confessionalization. Now, on the slide, the first slide here, confessionalization, I just give some definitions. And here I have the definition of the process or processes by which a particular religious confession, such as the Confession of Augsburg, became the basis for territorial state building. I left off the close quotation marks there. That definition is my definition, based on the scholarship of the last 50 years or so. but I think it's a way to understand what was going on when we talk about confessionalization or the confessionalization processes. I have up there the Confession of Augsburg, from the Confession of Augsburg to the Edict of Nantes. And what that is getting at is within the empire, within continental Europe, as I just kind of mentioned, we see the onset of confessionalization with the Confession of Augsburg in 1530. There are other confessions. I mentioned the Confession of the Four Cities, the Swiss Confession. And it really becomes a basis for imposing religious uniformity. And it is a document. Now, not every confessional document was a confession. And what I mean by that is what the documents, the various documents that became the foundation of the confessionalization of a given state or territory, were various texts. And not all of those texts were in the literary form or had the title Confession of, even as more confessions of were being developed, if that makes any sense. So we can talk about the confessional texts or the confessional documents. In the empire, it's very clear, Confession of Augsburg. What we will see in France, with the differing developments in France, was that the confessional document ended up becoming the Confession of Augsburg, together with, as a background, no, excuse me, strike that, that was not the Confession of Augsburg, it became the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes. But the Edict of Nantes was based on Calvinist positions and Catholic positions. I'll be talking about the Catholic confessional document, which are other decrees of the Council of Trent. The Calvinist confessional documents are essentially Calvin's institutes and his ecclesiastical ordinances, which became the basis for what constituted a Calvinist form of religious policy within a territorial state. So these still are documents, and they become confessional documents. And in England, we'll see that becomes what's become known as the Elizabethan Compromise, which I'll talk about more when we get there. So that kind of puts the broader perspective on what this lecture is going to be addressing today, and trying to include then a lot of the previous lecture as well within this overarching structure of confessionalization. And we have there the next point on the slide is the position of uniformity, and then followed by the emergence of the nation state. And that's really what we see in the course of the 16th century. As I've already mentioned, the imposition of uniformity within the medieval world on in through the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which I've discussed as a particular pattern of Reformation. There's much more freedom, much more leeway, because, too, doctrine had not been defined as extensively as it began to be with the onset of the Reformation. Meaning, let's say, you could be heterodox, which is not quite heresy, but it's not really orthodoxy. It's that in-between time positions. You could be heterodox in the Middle Ages and not be worried about being persecuted or arrested as a heretic and burned. There were no real heresy trials or burnings in the Middle Ages until really we get into the 14th century, when they begin to be individual cases of execution of heretics. There was censures. Peter Abelard in the 12th century, some of his writings were condemned, but he was not tried for heresy. He was not burned at the stake because some of his positions were condemned. It becomes increasingly dangerous and problematic to espouse heterodox positions, such as with Huss. That, too, was a major issue of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which we can already see beginning the attempt to enforce doctrine by political means, which had always been the case, going all the way back to Constantine. And then Theodosius, when Theodosius proclaims Christianity as the only legal religion in the empire, that meant that if you were not Christian, you could be prosecuted for treason, for crimes against the state. There's no records of burnings at the time, but there was the use of military force, as I talked about with Augustine and the issue of the Donatists, to enforce religious conformity. And that just continues. But during the Middle Ages, even though the principle was there, it became increasingly difficult because, number one, the lack of bureaucratic structures to enforce uniformity, number one. Number two, the relatively few doctrinal positions that were absolutely set. It was only in 1215, as I think I mentioned, that the number of sacraments was set as 7, and that the doctrine of transubstantiation was defined. Before 1215, there's a wide variety of opinions in terms of what constituted the sacraments, how many were there, and what was going on in the Eucharist. So that is kind of the situation that we have here. But once we get into this later Middle Ages and then on into the Reformation of the 16th century, and the various patterns of Reformation, we begin to see this crackdown based on attempts to define doctrine and to ensure and impose religious conformity. I think I mentioned last lecture towards the end in terms of the fingers of the state, so to speak, are increasingly being spread out in terms of the bureaucratic structures that were established to ensure religious conformity, also on increasingly the local levels, down to the village level, which before that was never the case. So that's what we're kind of looking at during this period to try to, what I'm trying to do is counter the narrative that has so often been espoused out there, but also taught, that the Renaissance and the Reformation are the beginnings of modernity because they usher in individual freedom, individual conscience, and toleration. That is completely ahistorical. That is reading back and not understanding what was going on. I think I mentioned, I'm pretty sure I did. If not, we'll mention it here. But talking about Calvin's Geneva and the burning of Michael Servetus, because Calvin recognized Servetus. Servetus was arrogant enough, he thought he could convince Calvin that he was right in terms of his anti-Trinitarian positions. And what did Geneva Small Council, the government, decide to do? To burn him. Calvin said, we should just behead him. It's more humane. And the city council said, no, we're going to burn him. And as a result of that, we have Sebastian Castellio, a humanist who was in Geneva, witnessing the execution of Michael Servetus, saying to burn a man is not to defend a doctrine. It is simply to burn a man. But that position was in the overwhelming minority. So I'm not saying that there was no one in the later 16th century who advocated for religious toleration. There were. But in terms of the overarching policy, it was never an issue. And it was the minority opinion. The Reformation did not bring about toleration. The Reformation resulted in the increasing lack of toleration, even as there was increasing diversity, which we can understand. With increasing diversity comes increasing attempts to define who we are over against these other quote-unquote options. So there is increasing diversity, plurality, but not freedom, not religious freedom, not toleration. There's a lack of toleration. So anyway, that's the overall scheme here is what we're looking at. And so having already dealt with these issues in terms of the empire and what was going on in the empire after the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, I turn now to the Reformation in France, because that too was a different situation. Now, last lecture I dealt with Calvin and Calvin's Geneva, but I also stressed how Calvin was always focused on France. and trying to convert France. And he was being successful with this kind of underground approach, and people from France, individuals from France coming and flooding into Geneva, and then going back into France to evangelize the French, and that they had even achieved some conversions of the princes of the blood. So that's kind of the situation we're dealing with here. And it is tense. I talk about this French wars of religion, and that's what it was, but still, it's civil war. And I'll get to this shortly, but it breaks out for the first time in 1562 and continues until 1559. So just as the civil wars in the empire have ended, so to speak, they're just beginning to heat up, and the worries of war are on the horizon in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg, because the tensions are so stringent. Now, Francis I had been King of France, and I mentioned that together with Charles V and Henry VIII, these young monarchs of Europe at the time. And I forget exactly when Francis dies. I believe it's in the 1540s. You can look it up, and I can look it up, and I should have, but I didn't. But when he died, his son Henry II ascended to the throne, and Henry had been betrothed to Catherine de' Medici, an Italian noblewoman from the Medici family. And actually, maybe shouldn't call her noble, because the Medici, even though they acted like nobility and everything else, they were not part of the royal line. But in Italy, with the city-states, there really was no royal line of Italy, because Italy was not an entity, a political entity. But of Florence, the Medici ruled Florence, and Leo X was a Medici pope, and they were the wealthiest family, and had been since the later 14th century anyway, and Catherine was from that family. So it was a nice alliance. And Henry II, when he came to the throne, was relatively young. I forget exactly how old he was. I think he was in his 30s or 40s. And Henry and Catherine were prolific. They had like 5 children or so, but they had 3 sons. I think they had another one that died early, but they had Francis II, Charles IX, and then Henry III. So I thought, we're pretty well set, meaning the dynasty, the Valois dynasty in France. Because Henry II is in good shape, and we have these 3 young boys, they'll be fine. Well, I don't know if any of you have heard of or seen the series, I forget if it's on Netflix or whatever, about, I think it's called, is it called The Dragon Queen or something like that? No, it's not, because it's not Game of Thrones, so that's not it, but it's about Catherine de' Medici. And it's a fairly somewhat decent representation, because Catherine ended up becoming one of these amazing women, essentially monarchs, leading France. But we'll get there. And all these stories about Henry II not really liking Catherine. He certainly had a mistress that he was devoted to. And Catherine had to learn to just put up with that, which she did. But still, the marriage produced a fair number of children. So they're sitting kind of pretty in the course of the 1540s, and so as conflicts breaking out, also worries of succession, knowing what was going on in England. So the Valois were good. Problem was, I should have gotten all these dates, I'm sorry, but it's in the early 1550s. Henry II was at a tournament. Now, tournaments had been going on for a while. They were in some ways, they were means of practicing military skills. Jousting is a major one. Because they're also part of this code of chivalry. And analogies have been made to the academic disputations in the universities with the tournaments in terms of chivalric culture and in academic culture. They're showpieces a lot of times, these disputations. So were tournaments. Kings rarely participated, but Henry wanted to participate. He was going to show everybody why he should be king. He was also showing off to his mistress, who would be there watching, as well as his wife, Catherine. And you can imagine it would be pretty awkward, to say the least, maybe even scary, if you had to joust against the king, because what if you beat him? The whole point of a tournament, of a joust, is to win. But if you're jousting against the king, how do you handle that? Anyway, Henry was clad in full armor. There's not going to be a problem. He'll win. If he doesn't win, it just shows how great his knights are. And he's well protected. The point of a joust was not to kill the other person, as it is when you're actually fighting. But what happened was, they're jousting along. Freak accidents, because even though Henry was completely covered in armor, the only aspect or part of him that was open was his eyes, the eyepiece of his helmet. As he's jousting, they clash, and a sliver of a javelin broke off and went right through his eye. I had to take my glasses off for that one. I was like, oops, oh my God. The only place he was vulnerable, freak accident, right through his eye, and he's dead. This was horrible. Francis II comes to the throne, but he's young again. So Catherine becomes the queen mother, the regent, ruling for her young sons. And this tension between her sons, and when do they reach their majority to rule on their own? But Catherine has to address the affairs of state, and she was a master at that. She arranged in 1559 a peace between the French and the Empire to the Cateau Cambrésis, known as the Ladies' Peace. And she was looking out for France. Now, obviously, she's a Medici, so that's an Italian. So she's on the papal side, as Henry II was upholding his father's, Francis I's, position of the King of France being the most Christian king, siding with the Pope. But it's like, what do we do with now all these Calvinists, who are also French nobles, some of them? It's not just the riffraff. We could deal with the riffraff. But they're princes of the blood, nobles who are in the direct line of succession to the crown, who have become Calvinists. And Catherine thought, okay, we need to deal with this one way or the other. And she decided to, I didn't put this up here, the colloquy of Poissy, to bring together the two sides. She invited Calvin to come, and she had her own Catholic theologians and bishops to come to talk about the issues. And can't we decide and figure this out and work this out on our own without it coming to bloodshed? Now, Calvin, in 1560, this was saying he's getting near the end of his life. I'm not going to go, but he sent Theodore Beza, his soon-to-be successor, right-hand man and successor, to go to discuss with the French doctrine, and doctrine as the basis of religious policy, also in terms of France, with the Princes of the Blood having been following Calvin. That was certainly known. So it was like, okay, and Catherine thought we should get this together. It's known as the Colloquy of Poissy, Poissy. Poissy. They couldn't come to a decision. They couldn't agree. Surprise, surprise. But they made some arrangements. They said, okay, the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, could continue to function and worship, but only in their own territories. They could not evangelize. They could not go out seeking new converts. and they could not be anywhere near Paris. So for the Huguenots, at least I was saying, okay, we're not going to go after you, but we don't want to see you. We don't want to see you. We don't want to hear you. As long as you're down there, one of the bastions of the Huguenots was in La Rochelle. And on your map, La Rochelle is kind of in northwestern France. If you're in those little outposts and territories, which are fairly far removed from France, fine, we're not going to bother you. But don't let us see you or hear you or have to deal with you. That was agreed upon. Well, it was agreed upon until, even though there's tensions, the leaders of the Catholic faction, the opposite of the Huguenot faction in France, was the Duke of Guise. The Duke of Guise were very fiercely Roman Catholic and thought any kind of compromise was unacceptable. This idea of one law, one faith, one king, we can't allow heretics to survive. Well, shortly after the Colloquy of Poissy, so we have what became known as the Massacre of Vassy, which is on there. And what's the Massacre of Vassy? The Massacre of Vassy was that the Duke of Guise was out hunting, part of his privilege as a duke, with his hunting party, of course, outside of Paris, but not all that far outside of Paris, and came upon, on their way back to Paris, back home after the hunt, they passed through this village of Vassy. And there they heard, in a farm, remote farm, in a barn, singing. It was the singing of psalms in French. No good Roman Catholic would be doing that. This was a group of Huguenots. They were not trying to flaunt what they were doing. They were just having their worship service in a barn, thinking that they were safe and adhering to the conditions of coming out of the Colloquy of Poissy. But the Duke of Guise heard them. And then the Huguenots were like, what do we do? Well, we're safe because we have the agreement after the Colloquy of Poissy. Not realizing that for the Duke, that meant we're not supposed to hear you at all. Even if we don't see you there in the barn, we could hear you singing, and that is not allowed. The Duke stops, goes in, and slaughters them all. This event led to what's referred to as the First Religious War of 1562, because the Huguenots are angry. They're very angry, and also the Princes of the Blood are angry. How dare they do that? They have violated the agreement. The Catholic side was, no, we're not. What do we do? Back and forth. Well, Catherine had a real problem on her hands. Outbreak of the First War of Religion, 1562 to 1563. I'm not going to go into all the details of all of it. There's a series of 7 or 8 religious wars, depending on how you count them. More like individual battles and things. It died down. Neither side achieved a definitive victory, nor would they until later. We'll get there. And they kind of go back to the status quo ante, the status quo coming out of the agreements coming out of the Colloquy of Poissy. Now, the problem was this. Francis II was not all that healthy, and he ended up dying. So Charles IX then ascended to the throne. I see Catherine still said, okay, yeah, Charles IX, I still have Charles, I still have Henry III. Charles IX too was young, so Catherine still reigns as Queen Regent and Queen Mother. And she comes up with a solution, finally, to the religious problem because Anthony of Bourbon was one of the leaders of the Huguenots, the noble leader of the Huguenots. And I forget if it's his son or his nephew, was Henry of Bourbon, who was King of Navarre, or heir to the King of Navarre. Of marriageable age, Catherine had a daughter, Marguerite, who was of marriageable age. And she says, if we can arrange the marriage of my daughter, Marguerite, with Henry of Navarre, that is an alliance that can maybe mitigate the tensions and problems in a way to solve the religious issues. So let's have this royal wedding. Both sides agreed. And it would be held in Paris in August, late August of 1572. So far, so good. Nice idea. The Guise, though, started scheming, not with Catherine, but with Charles IX, who's still young. By this time, I think he's in his early teens, maybe. And he wants to, rule on his own. And what they're saying is, okay, we didn't really want this wedding and alliance, but maybe we can use this to our advantage because everybody will be in Paris. What we should do is strategically assassinate the leaders of the Huguenots. So Anthony of Bourbon, get rid of him, a couple of others. And that will take care of the matter. Because if we can get rid of the leaders, the rest will follow along. And we don't have to worry about the riffraff again. Charles said that sounds like a good idea. And Catherine was like, no. But finally she went along with it, saying, okay, if we just keep it kind of secretive and targeted, that might help. So everybody comes to Paris for the royal wedding, August 24th, 25th, Paris. St. Bartholomew's Day was the 24th. Had the wedding, whereupon then Henry IV, again was a Calvinist, was placed under house arrest. And the executions, the assassinations, got way out of hand, and it turned into a complete bloodbath and massacre, known as the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. Not only was Anthony of Bourbon was killed, but all the leading Huguenot leaders, nobles, were executed. But this spread beyond Paris too. It was almost like open day, go kill Huguenots. It was horrific. Henry they didn't kill because he had just married him, but he was under house arrest, and he had to be told that either you have a choice: you can remain here, but you need to convert to Catholicism. If you don't convert to Catholicism, you'll be the next person that we execute. After all, you just married the French princess. Henry said, oh, okay, I'll convert. So he converts to Catholicism. Then he escapes court. Goes back to Navarre and renounces his conversion. So in some ways it's like he converts back to Calvinism. But after St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Henry of Navarre is now heir to the throne after the Valois. Charles IX, Henry III. And the next one in line would be Henry of Navarre. And he's the leader of the Huguenots. What do? Well, to make, again, more complex story short, I'm trying to keep this short. I'm already going more extensively than I had planned because this is just too exciting. I know it's like it would be even more exciting if we could go into all the details. Um, Charles IX dies, and so Henry III comes to the throne. Now, both Francis II and Charles IX died before they could have children. Marriages were being worked on and arranged, but there was no offspring. Henry III came into his majority and starts to rule on his own. But the problem with Henry III was he didn't like women very much. So there wasn't going to be an offspring there. And because he liked his little poodles. Actual poodles. And it was like, oh my God, what do we do with this? He's not French. If he's going to, like boys or men, fine, but at least fulfill your duty as king and be a man. Well, Henry went back and forth, so to speak. And meanwhile, you have the Guise who are in opposition. You have Henry III caught in the middle, and you have Henry of Navarre on the other side. And there was even one of the French wars of religion was called the War of the Three Henrys, between Henry, Duke of Guise, Henry III, and Henry of Navarre. Because tensions are still going crazy. And even though Henry III knows he's the Christian king of France, in some ways he's more ironic, like his mother, trying to solve things. And the Guise are being so vicious and vile that we have to exterminate and get rid of all the Huguenots. In that sense, then Henry III names Henry of Navarre as his heir, which was the blood succession. The problem was, in 1589, or 1588, I forget which, 1588 or 1589, Henry III is assassinated. The Guise faction, not by the Duke of Guise, but I'm sure he was aware of it and sanctioned it. It's like, we have to get rid of this person. This is not right. So if we just get rid of him, we can go from there. They knew that Henry of Navarre was the next in line, but there's no way in hell they were going to allow a Huguenot or a Protestant to be king of France. So they had their plans of what to do, and whom they were going to put forward, and the arguments that they were going to make. Namely, it's not so much an issue of blood, it's an issue of tradition and purity of faith. That's what they were arguing. Interestingly enough, before that, the Huguenots were arguing that no, it's an issue of faith, yes, and blood. But they switched because the Huguenots previously had argued it's an issue of blood. So Henry could not accede to the throne because he was not part of the line. But anyway, it gets very confusing, and there's flip-flopping in the political theories. Because after the assassination of Henry III, Henry IV is the rightful, by blood, heir to the throne. How do we handle this? Now, Henry IV, or excuse me, Henry Navarre, he's not Henry IV quite yet. In contradiction, or in very clear distinction from Henry III, whom he was allied with, was truly a man's man, so to speak. And he was a great general and warrior. And he said, I'm not going to convert. I'm going to go and I'm going to take what is mine. And he fought his way in. And only after he completely defeated the Guise and the Catholic League opposed to him, and riding his horse, entering into Paris, 1592, I believe this is, did he establish himself as King of France. And then he said, as a gift to the country, I will convert to Catholicism. He didn't want to convert first. The Guise were saying, well, if you convert, we will accept you as the rightful king. Henry says, no, screw you. I am rightful king. I will establish myself first. If you're not going to follow me, no, to hell with you. I'll make you pay. And that's what he did. He made them pay. So there's been a lot of debate and discussion. I mean, supposedly it's apocryphal, but supposedly Henry said Paris is worth a mass, but that's an apocryphal statement. What he meant by that was simply, I'm going to assert my own authority first. That as a gift to the country, I will convert. I'm not going to go into all the different arguments in terms of the analysis of his conversion and what was behind it, what was it all about. The point was whether we're talking about Henry's own intentions. The position that came about became known as the politique position, which had been there before. In some ways, that was Catherine's position. What is best for France? Forget religious purity. What is best for France? In some ways, that was Francis I's position until the affair of the placards in 1534. So we see this progression of trying to say, let's go beyond religious purity. What is good for France? Because the nation state, which I'll be talking about and have talked about, is emerging, becomes primary consideration. And that was what was behind Henry's conversion. What is best for France? I can see it. I will convert. But yet then he issues in 1598 the Edict of Nantes, proclaiming Huguenots, Calvinism, acceptable within France, but not in Paris. They could even evangelize and seek converts. They could openly practice their faith, their beliefs, their religion, but not in Paris. That settled the religious wars in France. 1598, the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes was not really a confessional document, but it served the purpose of solving the problems because it ended the conflict, the military conflict. It ended the war and the bloodshed and saying, we will accept both. And Henry, as the strong ruler he was began to be seen as a hero in France and has ever since. Certainly was able to enforce that. Now, for the Calvinists, still, the confessional documents are Calvinist institutes and the ecclesiastical ordinances. And for the Catholics, it's the decrees of the Council of Trent, which have been issued during the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, which I'll be getting to shortly. So that's where we see what's going on here. And Henry IV, as he becomes Henry IV, King of France, was from a different family. I mean, he was cousins with the Valois. He was from the Bourbon. And he's the first Bourbon or Bourbon King of France. And he had a son, and we'll see later, Louis, became Louis XIII, whose son was Louis XIV. That's where this comes about. Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes 100 years after it was issued, going back to this concept of France as one faith, one law, one king. That again is for the next part of this course. For Henry, that's right, Henry gets assassinated in 1610. Just to let you know what's coming up. So there's a series of assassinations from both sides, and it gets to be a real god-awful mess. The opposite of toleration. So that was going on in France. Now, when we move then to the Catholic Reformation, which I just mentioned in terms of the confessional documentation, documents being the decrees of the Council of Trent, this was the Catholic attempt to deal with the issues that arose as a result of Luther and the Reformation within the empire, the conflicts within the empire. Calls to a council. Luther had called for a council. And the problem was that appeal to a council over the head of the Pope was condemned. It had been condemned. Conciliarism had been condemned in 1462 by Pope Pius II. And so Luther's calling for a council was going to go nowhere, even though there was increasing calls for that. Because what are we going to do here? Charles V was kind of stuck. How do we handle this? And the sense was, until a council really can decide what's going on here, what do we do? Now, it took a while before the papacy could get a council together. There was an election early on, and it was almost one of the reforming parties, because there were reforming parties within the Catholic fold too, especially in Italy, a group known as the Spirituales. And how do we handle this? Meanwhile, what was developing were the new religious group. There's a number of new religious orders developing in the 16th century, but one of them in particular is of importance. Namely, that's the group known as the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. Officially, they're referred to as the Society of Jesus. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder. He was a Spanish nobleman, fighter, therefore, too, and he'd been wounded in battle. This is in the 1520s, later 1520s. And as he's recuperating, he's been given books to read. He reads the Legenda Aurea, which are stories of saints' lives, and The Imitation of Christ, which was a work by Thomas à Kempis in the 15th century. So he's reading late medieval religion and piety. And Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ was very similar to Jordan Quedlinburg's Meditations on the Passion of Christ. And Loyola had a conversion experience. I've been a soldier for Spain. Why don't I become a soldier for Christ? Now, there were military orders, but they were also kind of controversial. So I'm going to start a new order. Not so much in his head of the idea, but I'm going to start a new approach. What does it take to be a good soldier? It takes discipline, it takes rules, it takes an examination of your own self. And Ignatius wrote a work and then started revising it, known as the Spiritual Exercises. It was a manual for how to prepare yourself for spiritual warfare. Nothing like it had ever been written. This is not simply individual personal piety or devotion, but it was for a group who wanted to put this into practice, and it was a month-long program that you could then repeat, but it was a month-long program and regimented. He started having followers, and they started doing this. He caught the attention of the papacy of like, oh, we need to be wary, because he's just really on the borderline of heresy. He was brought before the Inquisition a couple of times, cleared, before he finally received approval. And one of his platforms was education. We can beat the Protestants if we can show how wrong they are. To become a full Jesuit, even today, I believe, you have to have a PhD. You have to go through as much education as you possibly can. I mean, the same in the 16th century. We're going to know our stuff better than they do. They are claiming that they know the scriptures better than the Catholics. We're going to show them that they're wrong. We're going to show them that we know it. And they also ended up establishing a whole network of schools. So this whole point was, we have to teach the people. We're going to do that. That's going to be our means of attacking error, i.e. Protestantism. So we have the Jesuits as one of the main forms of this new reform within the Catholic fold, which is, yes, predominantly in Italy, but also in France too, and elsewhere. And we see too a number of institutions being established to explicitly counter Protestants, namely the Index of Prohibited Books, 1543 it's established or so, to say these books are banned, at least until they're corrected, because they're filled with heresy. And then also the Roman Inquisition. Spanish Inquisition had been established in 1492. I think I already mentioned there was no such institution as an Inquisition within the Middle Ages. There were individual inquisitors inquisitions, namely investigations. Jordan of Quedlinburg was appointed as inquisitor to a case in Magdeburg. They killed their archbishop. But there was no centralized institution that was established in opposition to the Protestants, the Roman Inquisition. And then the confession, or they also then had a catechism, the Roman Catechism. The first Roman Catechism comes out in 1556. It's late, as part two of this approach to, well, if the Protestants are going to do this, we can do this even better. And then the Council of Trent to say we are going to put our house doctrinally in order, religiously in order, and finally we're going to put it together. Even though the Reform Party within the papacy came very close to being elected Pope, Paul IV finally calls a council. He is one of the more hardline version, and the Council of Trent meets in 1545. And in a series of sessions or meetings between 1545 and 1563, they establish Catholic doctrine that would be the basis of Catholicism, and by now, too, definitely Roman Catholicism, until the Second Vatican Council opening in 1961. The next 400 years almost. Set doctrine. And the decrees of the Council of Trent were to be published and spread throughout Catholic territories as saying this is where we stand. It is very much a confessional document. Now I have up here, first of all, the problem of terminology, which I didn't even address because I wanted to come back to it here. I have up here the Catholic Counter-Reformation, because the whole issue of the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation has been a problem, what to label and call these things, because as you know, I hope by now, how we label things affects how we understand them and view them. Traditionally, it's been called the Counter-Reformation, but the scholars for quite a while now have shown, but you know what, that's not really accurate. There were aspects that were explicitly intended to counter Protestantism. But the Catholic Reformation was broader than that. As I portray it, is both a Catholic Reformation and a Counter-Reformation. And the Catholic part of this is growing out of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. In some ways, the Catholic Reformation was the continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, based on personal conversion. But yet it's added this additional element of the increasing definition of doctrine. And they had to also admit, and they did in some ways implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly, that Luther was right about a lot of things. The first thing they addressed was the issue of justification. The decree on justification could almost have been cut and pasted from a lot of Luther's works. It's based on passive righteousness. It says, no, the justice of God is not that by which God judges justly, but the justice by which God makes us just. There's no issue of salvation by works or works righteousness. Absolutely not. It's all based on predestination and God's grace. That was the official position of the Council of Trent in responding to the Protestants. But, they said, here's the difference. It is infused in us, God's righteousness. God actually makes us righteous so that we actually become righteous. It's an intrinsic righteousness. Luther's position was an extrinsic righteousness. It's outside of us. And Luther will say what distinguishes us from the papacy is not morals. We're just as bad as they are. This doctrine. And the Catholics come along and says, yes, but no, it was that intrinsicness, which is the same position of justification as the Augustinian position of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, that Luther didn't know. He hadn't been taught, was unaware of. So that is what's going on here with the Council of Trent. And they go on to say, again, based on that same position that the Augustinian position in the later Middle Ages. Faith that is not active in works is dead. It's not just an intellectual, oh, yeah, that's what it is. You have to put it into action with works of love. Faith formed by love. That was the official position. So it's not by the works of charitable works or good works that we're saved. We're saved by faith. But faith, to be real, has to be put active in love. That was the position. Then they went on to deal with other abuses in the church and everything else to set the Catholic position in order, finally, in response to all the controversies of the 1520s and 1530s and 1540s, even as during the later 1540s, 1550s, and 1560s, there's turmoil throughout Europe. That's what is going on. So, if they could have gotten their act together and had a council in the 1530s, that might have avoided some of the problems, because Charles V could have said, you know what, the council has spoken, this is the way it is. But he had to wait too long, and it allowed for the establishment of different positions, also politically. It's never an issue simply of individual belief, ever, in this period, or for all of this course. It's a matter of politics. How do we put it together? That's why I say a renewed religionization and confessionalization. If we look at religionization as a way of how does you become a true religious once you've converted, coming from the 12th century on, that became the platform for the Reformation of the late Middle Ages. Confessionalization really becomes the platform for the Protestants. And the Catholics kind of say we need to do both. We continue this religionization as we are then also saying, and here is the doctrine that we're standing by. Those are some of the different issues. They're doing so during this period. That in England, it's also going back and forth in terms of the balance. They have up here Elizabeth I and the foundations of the Civil War. I think in the previous lecture I got up to Elizabeth I. And what happens there? Because I went through the issue of the succession from Henry VIII, Edward VI. He dies, succession problems. That's why, France didn't think they were going to have any problems. Edward dies, and then Mary comes to the throne, Bloody Mary, and then Mary dies, even though she had already married Philip, the second of Spain. And Elizabeth is caught in the middle. What do we do? Here I have up here Elizabeth I and the foundations of civil war, because Elizabeth, who was, again, one of the outstanding monarchs of the 16th century, had to secure her own authority and independence. So even though she had numerous suitors, she's referred to as the Virgin Queen. I'm not going to, doesn't matter whether she was a virgin or not, but she never married, because her point too was England is important. The crown is important, and I am embodying that crown in England. And I am a head of state. I'm not going to give that up to a man. Now, there's tensions immediately after the death of Mary, because Philip II says, I am the rightful monarch of England. Well, by this time, there's going to be no, English noble, even the Catholic faction, that really wanted to hand over England to the Spanish king. Catholic king, okay, but no, not really. Because even the arrangement with Mary is that she would still be monarch. It was only their offspring who would be monarch of both. So Spain, again, is shunned by England, as they had been all the way back with Henry VIII. They had been close allies, and Henry had been, married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess. So that was going to make that alliance there. And then he divorces her and gets rid of her, makes it annulled, which upset the Spanish. And now they thought everything was back okay with Mary and Philip, until Mary dies, and then Elizabeth says, no, get the hell out of our affairs. And that upset Philip so much, he prepared for an invasion of England. We had the famous Spanish Armada of 1588. And Elizabeth defeats the Spanish attempt to take over England for Philip's claims, but there are tensions there ongoing. But Elizabeth, who comes to the throne in 1559, after Mary's death, has to deal with what do we do with the religious issue. And her solution became known as the Elizabethan Compromise, which was the reassertion of the state church, the Anglican Church of England, the Church of England. Elizabeth was more Protestant, certainly, than Mary, obviously, because she remained a Protestant. She was even more Protestant than her father, Henry VIII, but she wasn't as Calvinistic or as Protestant in any way, shape, or form as her brother or half-brother, Edward. So she's steers this middle course between the Catholic faction and the Calvinist faction to try to formulate a genuine Anglican faction. Independent from Rome, independent from Spain, we are leading an increasingly important world empire as it's beginning to emerge, which I'll talk a little bit more about next lecture. And there are, again, problems on all sides, but Elizabeth was able to negotiate it, and that led to her excluding and persecuting Catholics, for one. It's not that the Catholics were not persecuted. It was not, again, toleration. Catholics had to go into hiding under Elizabeth. She did not kind of counter Mary's approach in terms of killing all the Protestants, the Bloody Mary, but it was dangerous to be Catholic under Elizabeth. They had to go underground. There are, country estates with the chapels hidden, including places to watch out for potential royal troops coming through, that we get rid of all our paraphernalia. No, we're not having mass. But also, she didn't go so far as some of the Edwardian, let's say, groups did, of the real strong Calvinist factions. So they're upset with her. The Catholics are upset with her, but they're working it all together. And there, up here, the persecution of the Catholics and the exclusion of the Calvinists. And that led to an opposition party also within Protestants, within Parliament, that were that Calvinist faction and felt that the English church, the Church of England, had not gone far enough, that Elizabeth had sold out. And what we need is to purify the Church of England from anything that reeks of Roman Catholicism. This faction became known as the Puritans, the Presbyterian Puritan faction, allied to with Scotland. And it's got to be a real mess. Elizabeth was able to hold this together. They're the seedbed for war, because it really was a seedbed for war, because compromises often never really work because they don't satisfy really anybody. Elizabeth was able to hold it all together because she was such an amazingly strong leader and monarch of England during this period. Of course, her defeat of the Armada just led to her reputation, even if we can attribute a lot of it to the weather of the English Channel, but that doesn't matter too much. It's important for military history, but in terms of the image, she is seen as the savior of England over against Spanish attempts to invade. She holds everything together until her death in 1603. Then the tensions really began to make themselves felt. We have eventually the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. And we have the Puritans fleeing persecution and coming to the New World. That's where we're kind of getting this. Well, if we can't really practice our beliefs here, we can go there. We can be the city shining on the hill, shining our light on the world. And that is how that kind of connects to what was going on. Was it toleration and openness? No. Was it toleration that the Puritans could leave England and go to the New World? No. Was it toleration that led to, that prevented a civil war? No, it led to the Civil War. There were problems and issues throughout. So that is where we get with England in terms of the result of the Reformation. Now, this next slide up here, the witch trials, is simply there to further bring evidence of my position that I'm trying to present, is that the Reformation, especially in the later 16th century as it develops in the age of confessionalization, is increasing lack of toleration, because this is when the witch trials heat up and the burning of witches really starts to take off by both Protestants and Catholics. There were no witches burned in the Middle Ages. The manual used to snuff out witches, one of the primary ones, was only written in the 1490s, the Malleus Maleficarum. The witch trials began in the mid-16th century, and they really heat up all over. Protestants kill more than Catholics. Also in New England, famous witch trials of Salem, because they're seen as diabolical. This is not toleration. If you want to say the Reformation led to toleration, it's like, oh yeah, what about the witch trials, which really were an outcome of the age of confessionalization in the Reformation. Now there are too many details and too much complexity in terms of to go into all the details in terms of the witches and who were they. They were predominantly women, predominantly widows, suspects, people who did not fit into the expected norms of society could be accused of witchcraft. We have, with the Catholics, we have the Inquisition that can also investigate witch trials and be used for witch trials, but only after the mid-16th century. We have Protestants establishing their own means of enforcement and sniffing out. Witch hunts. Yes, there were witch hunts, because anybody that is deviant from what we expect is suspect. And if we're still talking about this medieval concept of heretics must be burned, even though I said there weren't many really burnings of heretics at all in the Middle Ages, but the idea is we have to get rid of them because they affect the eternal salvation of our souls. And the witchcraft was so problematic because they are associated with the devil. On the witches' Sabbath, they worship the devil and even have sex with the devil. That is as vile as it possibly can get. But it was based on belief. Is there any evidence that any witch ever had sex with the devil? No. That's kind of the issue. Belief is more important for understanding history than anything else. Understanding the beliefs, how did they develop? How did they arise? Why do people start believing things? And then they act on those beliefs. That's what this is all about. So the witch trials were an early modern phenomenon, not a medieval phenomenon. They arise in the context of the Reformation, confessionalization, and the cracking down on openness, the increasing attempt to enforce religious conformity throughout all levels of society down to the local level. That's what we're getting at. That is what the result and outcome of the Reformation and confessionalization was. Which brings me then to the final slide, toleration. And the only reason I come back to this is because it's such a widespread, so often repeated narrative that with the Renaissance and Reformation, we get toleration and individualism. That is all false historically, as false as it could be. We get the lack of toleration, the increasing clamping down on individualism, increasing diversity, multiplicity, but a lack of toleration. individualism does not even begin to be a thing until the Enlightenment. Here we still have this sense of having to ensure uniformity for the justice of all. This word justice, it's not individual justice. Individuals don't have rights. That's not the categories of individuals have rights. Classes, groups, whatever, nobles have rights and responsibilities and privileges. Every group within society has responsibilities, rights, and privileges. Individuals do not. That is not until John Locke in the late 17th century posits individual human rights, at least for male property owning citizens. Nothing of this course deals with individualism. Are there individuals? Absolutely. That's the other extreme. It's been argued that there were no concept of the individual in the Middle Ages. Absolutely not. People have always had a very strong view of themselves. The point is there were no individual rights that went along with the individual as an individual. The concept of individualism, as understood today, was not there in the Middle Ages. But it does not mean that people didn't have a sense of themselves. And we saw with Abelard a very strong sense of themselves, with Luther a very strong sense of himself. And he's not the first one. With Marsilius of Padua, a very strong sense of themselves. But they're working within a different framework in terms of rights, responsibilities, and privileges. Those kind of three all go together. And once you start taking those apart, if you start asserting rights without responsibilities and start having responsibilities without and associating responsibility, getting rid of responsibilities with rights and privileges go together. No, it has to be all three together, and that is what held society together. It had always done so, even as we see this paradigm shift from medieval world and culture and ideology, the myth of Christendom, to what was emerging in the course of confessionalization as the myth of the nation state, whereby the nation state was the basis for providing the structures of understanding reality and your own experience. That is what was going on. That's part of that transformation from medieval to early modern. It is essential, I think, for us to understand, for understanding what's going on in our world today and placing it within its historical context, because it's only within that concept that we can begin to understand what justice was at this time. Because justice was associated with the nation state, not with the individual. And the nation state still at this time was looking to God, because true justice is only divine. The problem is, how do we get to what true justice is? That in some ways is behind the developments of the Reformation. This attempt to find what the true justice of God means for us living in this world. And that led to division and the lack of toleration. And in so many ways, everything that we today think of as being the opposite of what is just. But for them, that was their pursuit. Now, there are more developments that contributed to this changing paradigm from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. And I'll be stepping back and looking at some of those developments in the next lecture, meaning basically the age of what's traditionally been called the age of exploration, new discoveries, trade, including the onset of the slave trade, and new fabulous influx of wealth. And the beginnings really of a connectedness of the world as there had never been before. But we'll be looking at that and the implications thereof next lecture, as we're getting very near the end of where this course ends. So if you have any questions, as always, simply just ask. We'll go from there, and I'll see you again shortly. Bye.